Hello and welcome to the Actual Tech Media Expert Series. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I am excited to be your moderator for this special event on exploring the pillars of a comprehensive security program. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that come in. That Q&A panel is also the place to just say hello, which a lot of you have been doing already. We love to hear where you're logging in from, and it's also the place to let us know if we can help in the unlikely event that you have any technical issues. A browser refresh is going to fix most of those issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A, and we'll provide further technical assistance. At the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for that prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom, and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Now, these Expert Series events are special product-neutral looks at pressing technology problems presented by an expert in the field. But the support of our sponsors make it possible for us to bring you this content. So we want to give a special shout out to those sponsors. Over the next few slides, I'm going to share some messages from our sponsors today, and I'll refer to links that you can find in the handout section of your console at any time during the presentation. Now, as always, the handout section also has a few valuable Actual Tech Media links. There's a link to the Gorilla Guide Book Club where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's great printed resources on technology topics. There's a link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events. And there's one other special link that I'd like to call out. It's new for us. It's in the Handouts tab, and it's the ATM Decisions Group. So certain members of our audience may qualify to join the new Actual Tech Decisions Group. It is the exclusive community for technology decision makers to get rewarded for evaluating solutions that solve their toughest technology challenges. Member exclusive benefits include invitations to evaluate curated best-in-class and emerging technology solutions, access to private buyer's guide discussions of their peers, and valuable rewards for every successful meeting and survey opportunity. So access to the decision group is available by application and only is open to technology professionals who actively play a role in the acquisition of new technologies. So if this sounds like you, click the link in your sidebar to apply and join. Now, before we get to the main presentation, a few words from our sponsors. We are supported by Nasuni. Nasuni is a leading file data services company that helps organizations create a secure file data cloud for digital transformation, global growth, and information insight. The Nasuni File Data Platform is a cloud-native suite of services offering user productivity, business continuity, data intelligence, cloud choice, and simplified global infrastructure. The platform and its add-on services replace traditional file infrastructure, including NAS, backup, and DR, with a cloud-scale solution. So by consolidating file data in easily expandable cloud object storage from Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, and others, Nasuni becomes the cloud-native replacement for traditional NAS and file server infrastructure. You can learn more by clicking on the link on your screen or the link in your handouts. Today's event is also sponsored by Palo Alto. Palo Alto Networks is the world's cybersecurity leader. They envision a world where each day is safer than the one before. Their next-gen security solutions, expert services, and industry-leading threat intelligence empower organizations across every sector to transform with confidence. So you can register for their upcoming network security hands-on workshops using the QR code on the screen or the link in your handouts. So once again, take advantage of that handout section where you can find all the links that you've just seen. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today, Allan Liska. Allan is a CSIRT at Recorded Future, but beyond his title, he's my favorite ransomware expert. He's involved in ransomware response 7 days a week. He's a first call from a lot of security industry insiders reporters, and government officials when there's a new attack type. And he's a regular contributor to our website, ransomware.org, as well as the author of the book with us, Ransomware Understand, Prevent, Recover, which is now in its second edition. So I am going to turn things over to Allan Liska.
Scott, appreciate it. And thank you all for attending today. Really appreciate your time. So we're going to talk a little bit about where we are with ransomware and what we're kind of expecting to see in 2023. One of the things that I get asked all the time is ransomware increasing or decreasing? Because there are a lot of conflicting reports out there. And the answer is we're not really sure. It's actually getting more difficult to track ransomware attacks because data leak sites or extortion sites have become an increasingly unreliable measure. Um, and so it's hard to see where ransomware stands totally. A great example of that is when the Hive ransomware was infrastructure was taken down in February. The FBI had reported that they handed out over 1,300 keys to victims, to known victims, and that was just the known victims they could get their hands on. So the real numbers probably well over 2,000, but we only knew about 200 Hive victims because that was all they had posted to their extortion site. Now, that doesn't mean the other 1,800 paid. There just may be a variety of reasons why they didn't show up on the extortion site or whatever. So so that makes it a lot harder for us to get a handle on the number. We think ransomware attacks were slightly down in 2022, and that trends continued a little bit in 2023, but we'll see where that ends up. And the other thing is there's been a diversity in the ransomware market where in 2021 we were tracking just over 30 extortion sites. Now that number's ballooned to over 140. So a big difference in the total number of ransomware groups, most of them small, what I like to call handcrafted artisanal ransomware. But they're not the kind of nice people that you find in a little shop in Vermont. So don't get me wrong there. What we do know though is that along with business email compromise, ransomware is still the most profitable cyber criminal activity. Nothing else has taken its place there. Another new trend that is worrying to me, at least, and to a lot of other people, is we're seeing much more involvement of nation state actors in ransomware. So we know that North Korea has always been involved in ransomware, at least back since WannaCry in 2017, but they've been much more active lately. North Korea is the only one of these groups that is essentially a cyber criminal group operating as a nation state. They want your money and they will happily take it. Uh, Russia and China use ransomware as a distraction attack, so they're going after certain targets, um, and they are deploying the ransomware as they steal data. So it looks like a cyber criminal attack, but really it's an espionage attack. And then Iran is really weird, man, because most Iranian ransomware attacks are uh, distraction attacks. They're either meant to disrupt activities or they're meant to distract for data theft. But then sometimes they actually want to get a ransom. And what we think is happening in Iran is Iran doesn't pay their operators very well at all. And so a lot of them moonlight. They basically take the ransomware home and carry out their own attacks. So you don't know whether you're dealing with an Iranian threat actor who's moonlighting or if you're dealing with the Iranian nation state. Either way, you probably don't want to pay a ransom to Iranian actor because there are sanctions involved and you can get fined and get in a lot of trouble with that. Russia, and to me, is really interesting because Russia is primarily known for wipers, right? So what Russia would do is they would deploy wipers, which destroys the system that they were on. But you can see toward the end of last year, they started moving more toward ransomware and away from wipers. They started with wipers disguised as ransomware and then moved to straight up ransomware. That lines up really well when Russia started their conscription campaign. When they started, when they realized they didn't have enough soldiers for the invasion of Ukraine, and so they started going out and conscripting people. Most ransomware actors in Russia are of conscription age, like they're the perfect target for conscription age. So what we think happened is Russia came to those guys and said, hey, you can either come work for us and do some ransomware, or you can go fight in Ukraine. And they all like, yep, let's go work for you and deploy ransomware. So that's where we start to see that change in tactics from only wipers to actually using ransomware in their attacks. And again, those same threat actors haven't stopped deploying ransomware on their own. They're just deploying Russian ransomware 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and then after 5 o'clock they're deploying whatever ransomware they would normally deploy. So that's kind of where we see this moonlighting become a real problem, at least in Iran and Russia, because all they're doing is improving their skills, which means they're a bigger threat to you when they go and do their sort of off government activities. We are also seeing extortion only attacks. So if you all remember last year, Lapsus was really famous for that. They broke into Uber, they broke into Okta and a few other places, and they would take data and threaten to release it unless you paid them money, but they wouldn't encrypt anything. Um, we're now seeing Karakurt and BNLAN as sort of the two leaders in that. Um, that basically they looks like a ransomware attack up until the data encryption part. There is no data encryption. Your data is copied and held for ransom. One of the things that we're not seeing yet, and I'm going to knock on wood when I say this, but we may start seeing in the future, is delete or steal and delete. Right now, we say stolen, but it's really just copied data. The ransomware actors haven't figured out that they might have a better set of leverage if they actually secure deleted the data, and that's why we don't talk about that on Twitter or anything else publicly. I'm going to share it with you all. We don't want to give them ideas. But it is something to think about in the future, because right now we don't know how profitable extortion only attacks are. Most people realize ransomware actors are lying bastards. They are not going to actually delete the data if you pay them a ransom. All you're doing is making it so they won't post it to the extortion site. They will sell whatever data they've stolen that they think is worth selling. In fact, we've seen that a number of times where victims of these extortion only attacks pay the ransom. The data is not published to the extortion site, but we see that same data set being sold in underground forums 6 months later. So they may have more leverage if they move to let's secure delete the data after we copy it off, and then it'll be more available to them. Where we're seeing attacks, we are seeing more attacks on national governments. We're also seeing more attacks on things like realtors, auto dealerships, dental offices, construction companies. We've seen a big increase in attacks there. And it's not that ransomware actors are targeting construction companies. It's that a lot of the other companies that have been targeted, a lot of the sectors that have been targeted before, have improved their security, and construction is kind of lagging behind in terms of security investment. So you'll still see though that like manufacturing um, is really big in terms of attacks. The education sector is really big in attacks. The problem with the education sector is they don't have the money to invest in improving security, so they're constantly being hit. Transportation, shipping, and logistics are another big problem. We're seeing a lot of those, and the ransomware actors like those attacks because they tend to be really impactful and they make the news, and anything that makes the news for the ransomware actors up to a point is good for their for lack of a better term, their rep, and that allows them to attract more affiliates and so on. We're also seeing a lot of ransomware get bigger. So, Lockbit, for example, now has more than 1,500 victims posted to their extortion site. And we're seeing a lot of the ransomware as a service attract more and more affiliates. And so some of them are getting fairly large. The problem is for them, they tend to get really large and then they go boom. whether it is from infighting, from law enforcement, from pissed off Ukrainian researchers, as in the case of Conti. Um, when they when they get really big, they tend to come crashing down. Now that doesn't mean that they stop doing ransomware; they just go and start another group. But you can see that most of the really big groups at some point have been, in terms of victims posted to extortion site, at some point have been knocked offline. Really, the only big group that hasn't been taken down right now is Lockbit, and we think that's going to change at some point in the next few months here. Fingers crossed, at least. Um, so, who are the most active actors right now? If you're looking at 2023 through the end of March, or almost the end of March, right now we see a lot of Lockbit, AlpV, Royal Ransomware, Play, and Bien Lean ransomware. And don't let the Bien Lean name fool you. Even though that is of Chinese origin, they are definitely located in Russia. Um, so that's kind of where we see the big groups right now, at least in 2023. Um, and what's interesting, if you look at these, let me jump here. If you look at these, and we're going to talk more about this in a minute, Royal Ransomware, Beanlin Ransomware, and Vice Society. So of the sort of the top ones that aren't Lockbit, 3 of the 5 top ones are not ransomware as a service, and they are just a core group doing their own thing. Play Ransomware is a traditional ransomware as a service model, but I do think it's interesting, and we'll talk a little bit more about why some of the ransomware groups are moving away from the ransomware as a service model. I do want to jump back to this. We are seeing some interesting leading trend lines. So I have this chart backwards, and I do apologize for that. If you look at the bottom of the chart, these are tracked quackbot infections, and then the top of the chart are confirmed Black Basta infections. So Black Basta relies heavily on quackbot, which is what used to be called a banking Trojan, but it's really morphed and modified, and it's now more of an information stealer. But it's also a loader for other types of malware. In particular, there's a very close relationship between the teams at Quackbot and the teams at Black Basta, where if it's a good enough target, Quackbot will load Black Basta for them, and obviously in return for a fee. So you can start to track some of these loaders and some of these infections, um, and see the direct tie between the loader campaign and the ransomware campaign, which is why it's not enough just to stop ransomware. You actually have to be able to stop these loaders and these sort of little nuisance attacks, because those nuisance attacks do lead to ransomware. So when you're thinking about your defense, you need to think about your defense holistically. When we talk about defense in depth a lot in this industry, but this is a great example of why. If you stop that quackbot infection, you don't get that black pasta infection. So going back to the point about ransomware getting smaller and moving away from ransomware as a service, in 2022, we tracked more than 500 new ransomware variants. Now, I'm gonna say that when we say new, they're not really new, because a lot of these rely on stolen code. There's a number of leaked Conti, there's a number of leaked Lockbit, Rebel, Chaos. All of these leaked ransomware groups, or all of this leaked ransomware code set that's out there, and a lot of these smaller ransomware groups are just simply using the stolen code to build their new ransomware. Some of these, we only see 1 or 2 victims of them. Some of them morph, as we've said, into relatively successful but standalone groups, not relying on the RAS model. And a big part of that is what we talked about earlier. When the RAS groups get too big, they tend to get shut down, whether it's through internal or external forces. And so a lot of ransomware actors are saying, you know what? I just want me and my 5 buddies to sit around and drink vodka and do ransomware. I don't want to be part of a bigger group. There are a lot of advantages to going to the RAS model, the ransomware as a service model. Um, in that, you have somebody else that's maintaining the code, you have somebody else that can handle the negotiation, you can even pay them to launder the money for you. So there's a lot of advantages to that. The disadvantages, if they get popped, you could wind up being arrested, because what happens when the big ransomware groups do get tagged is it's not the leaders of the group, because the leaders of the group tend to be in Russia, and they're not really touchable by traditional law enforcement. But the affiliates are spread out all over the world, and law enforcement has been effectively using intelligence gathered from things like stopping Hive and seizing their infrastructure to track down where these affiliates are when they're outside of Russia. And there have been a lot of ransomware arrests over the last year. It's one of the things that's really nice to see law enforcement taking this seriously. In fact, the United States has even elevated ransomware to a national security threat, which gives them additional law enforcement capabilities to use. Now, the problem is we're still playing whack a mole, right? You knock one down, one pops up. Um, and so, even though law enforcement is getting better, no matter how good you get at whack-a-mole, the mole still wins unless you can, figure out how to pull the plug. And the only way to pull the plug on ransomware actors right now seems like drone strikes, but I don't think we're allowed to do that legally. Um, so, uh, so what we'll see then is this continued growth of these smaller ransomware groups. A lot of it using stolen code. And that's where you get a lot of the rise of what I call Franken ransomware. And I know there's somebody in the comments right now who's getting ready to type, it should be Frankenstein's Monsters ransomware. And I get it, you're absolutely right, but that won't fit on the title here. So you're just going to have to settle for Franken ransomware and accept the fact that I'm fully aware that I'm using the term incorrectly, but I can't help it. Complain to Microsoft for not giving us enough line in there. But a great example of this is the ESXi ARGS ransomware. The ESXi ARGS ransomware that in February hit a number of ESXi machines was a combination of the vulnerability, the known publicly reported vulnerability, targeting patch servers, but then using one ransomware, and using one ransomware that had been out there already, and the code had been leaked, but bolting on the encryption from another ransomware, and then adding onto it the note from the CheersCrypt ransomware. So kind of three different ransomwares kind of built together. And so you kind of see where we'll see more and more of that, where with all these code leaks out there, it's relatively easy for new ransomware actors to build their own ransomware from all of these components that are out there. And I do think we'll see a lot more of that. The other thing that the ESXi ARGs attacks show is the interest in ransomware groups um, of sort of mass exploitation. We just saw this with Clop and the Go Anywhere, which we're still getting all the data from. So Clop claimed to have hit 130 victims by exploiting Go Anywhere. And they've started posting those victims to their extortion site. So that sort of mass exploitation is going to be something that the ransomware actors look for. And remember, a lot of these ransomware groups have made a lot of money. They can afford to buy vulnerabilities on the underground market in the same way that nation state actors do. So expect to see more of these kind of campaigns. Now, again, knock on wood, the good news with both ESXi ARGs and the Clop ransomware campaign is, at least on the surface, it doesn't look like a lot of damage was done. Yes, ESXi ARGs hit 3,000 servers. That's big headlines. But most of these are VM systems that had backups, and they were able to restore and bring them back up without having to pay the ransom. I think the actor behind this we were able to track less than $200,000 in ransom payments. For 3,000 victims, that's basically nothing. And same thing with Clop. The reason that Clop has posted almost all of the 130 victims is the data they were able to steal from their vulnerability is hasn't been valuable enough to pay a ransom, and there's no indication that anything was encrypted based on the servers they were able to gain access to. Now, I want to be clear, ransomware actors get really good at doing these things when they repeat them. So just because the first two campaigns, like mass exploitation campaigns, haven't been successful in terms of the damage, although they've been successful in terms of a lot of press for them, doesn't mean that the next one won't be really bad. So just something to keep in mind, something to think about kind of as you're planning. Next, I want to talk a little bit about all of the other things that are being hit by ransomware. So, ESXi, so we talked about ESXi ARGs, but we also are seeing more ransomware targeting Linux. We're also seeing some ransomware targeting Macs. What we're not seeing is mass Mac ransomware events. I know that's a mouthful to say. What we're seeing is single machine Macs being hit by ransomware. So when we talk about the other kinds of ransomware, Linux ransomware, ESXi ransomware, obviously Windows-based ransomware, we're talking about attempts at mass exploitation events where you're trying to take out every system in the network. In this case, what we're talking about is a single machine at a time being hit with Mac ransomware. Still a problem if you're using a Mac, but it's not a problem if your whole organization is on Macs. You're not seeing that as a problem yet. So, but everything else, just keep in mind that ransomware actors are trying to exploit and encrypt everything they can. And then much more aggressive extortion attacks. It does appear, based on data that a study by Chain Analysis did, that not only may there be fewer victims of ransomware, but there are fewer victims who are willing to pay. There's a lot of stigma associated with paying a ransom. And a lot of times now your insurance company won't compensate you if you pay a ransom. So a lot of victims are just, no, we're not going to pay anymore. So what we're seeing is ransomware actors find new and super intrusive ways to try and gain the ransom payment from victims. So, for example, one ransomware group recently posted photos of breast cancer patients that were stolen from a hospital. Another, we see this repeatedly with schools where ransomware actors will release sensitive counseling data or sensitive information on the students from the schools that was stolen, things like that. And then, Lockbit, we see will try and embarrass victims by posting the negotiations that that they carried out, again, in an attempt to embarrass the victims. I don't know that that's a very effective tactic, but some of the other things may wind up being effective. But it's kind of like that abuser mentality, unfortunately, where it's your fault that I have to post these awful pictures, or your fault that I have to share these awful bits of information. If you had paid, you wouldn't have had this problem. Which is why I'm a big advocate for drone strikes, because I just have no sympathy for people that have no sympathy. But again, legally, that's questionable. So that's kind of where we are. I know that's a lot to kind of go over. So Scott, hopefully there's some questions that you and I can talk about, and I'm happy to answer anything I can.
Yeah, Alan, great stuff. Lots of questions coming in. And this one came in early. What big trends do you see for ransomware in 2023? Obviously, that's what you've been talking about the whole time. So I'll sort of recap what I heard here. And then if I missed anything, maybe you could bring it up. But, bad actors working for Russia and Iran, sort of moonlighting their own attacks. That was really interesting. More extortion-only attacks. Then the attackers moving downstream to industries that have invested sort of less in defensive security measures. and that sort of whole balancing act between ransomware groups having to, they want to gain reputation with high profile attacks, but then they also have to keep themselves off the radar of the authorities and their security industry partners who can take them out. We heard about, that sort of leading to this atomization of the attack landscape, where you've got a lot of new variants as sort of as bad actors move out of the groups and just sort of launch attacks with a few trusted colleagues. And then the Frankenstein's monster attacks, as you clarified there. Does that pretty much cover it? Was that
Yeah,
that all the themes?
yeah. I think right now that seems to be everything that we're seeing. Obviously it's a very dynamic space. Otherwise we wouldn't be doing so many of these.
Yeah.
So things will change as the year evolves, but right now that's kind of what we're seeing as the beginning part of the year.
So, sort of a follow up question to that is, our theme today is sort of like, what's the layered security approach, to ransomware? Given sort of those trends that you're talking about, does that change anything about the way that you need to protect yourself against ransomware in terms of the defensive measures that you put up, or the policies that you put in place?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things that are changing. The big thing that I think a lot of companies have to worry about right now is not even part of traditional defense, but what's going on with your cyber insurance?
Yeah.
Because recovering from a ransomware attack is really expensive, and even if the insurance company won't pay the ransom, they will help you recover the cost from a ransomware attack. And because cyber insurance companies are so concerned about this, they're starting to raise premiums, but they're also starting to deny a lot of companies payments.
Mm.
So when your cyber insurance comes up for renewal, you'll likely have a pen test you'll have to complete, and you'll have to do more than just fill out a questionnaire. There's going to be a lot more that's required from you. So even before you think about defenses, you have to think about, hey, am I actually going to have cyber insurance next year? Is it going to be worth it? um, so that's a big thing that people need to worry about. And then we go back to a lot of the things in the ransomware attack itself haven't changed. The tools and the tactics that the ransomware actors are using once they get in the network, they haven't changed that much. We're still seeing a lot of Cobalt Strike. We're seeing a little more Brute Ratel. Heavy focus on Active Directory, but with these mass exploitation campaigns, one of the things that you really have to do is you're going to have to be much more responsive in your security patching. I know the way a lot of organizations work, even a high level patch, they can take several weeks to get out. You may not have that time anymore, especially for anything that is internet exposed.
Right.
So that's something that you need to be thinking about as ransomware, especially if ransomware actors stop trying to adapt start trying to use more of these mass exploitation campaigns. You'll have to patch quickly in order to better accommodate or better prepare against those. So those are kind of some of the things that I'd be thinking about. And then credential management for your Linux and ESXi servers. I know we've said this forever, but please don't leave your um, all of your Linux admin passwords in a spreadsheet on your desktop, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But so we talked a little bit about Quackbot and Black Hat ransomware. Well, um, one of the things that they'll do is they will, once they get in the network, they'll start to deploy Quackbot on other machines. And the reason that they do that is, one, it gives them easy access to the other machine, but also because there's keyloggers on those machines, or as part of Quackbot. So you can deploy it and the keylogger. So then if you need passwords, you have all the passwords that you've gotten from the keylogger. And that's why that loader defense becomes so much more important. So even if you're not leaving your passwords in a spreadsheet on your desktop, if you're typing them into the Linux machine and you have Quackbot installed, they now have the credentials for your Linux machines, for your ESXi machines, and so on. So really focusing on those early intrusions is, I think, super important right now.
Interesting. And you mentioned about the cyber insurance companies requiring pen tests. Do they come in and do their own, or do they require you to get one from one that they recognize? How does that process work?
It depends on the cyber insurance company. It depends on the size of the client. Sometimes they will come in with their own people, but other times it'll be, here's 10 vendors you can choose from, and pick one, and we'll accept their results.
Gotcha.
So they won't just say, if you had Joe's tackle shop and pen testing down the street do your pen testing for you, that may not be enough.
Gotcha. Here's another question, and you talked a bit about this, but it's what are the most vulnerable industries for ransomware? What are you seeing in terms of the increase in attacks?
Yeah. So when we talk about, in particular, manufacturing and construction right now,
Mm-hmm.
those they're not so. And I always want to be clear here. Most ransomware attacks are not targeted in a traditional sense. So it's not that the ransomware actors specifically are going after construction or manufacturing or shipping or so on, but what they're finding is they're finding the vulnerabilities they like to exploit are most often available, with those industries. So whether they're doing a credential stuffing attack or exploiting a vulnerability or whatever, those industries tend to be most vulnerable. And so I always like to clarify that, but that is when we look at, so most ransomware groups don't conduct their own initial access. They buy access from initial access broker, and those initial
Mm.
access brokers are constantly looking for new credentials. They're constantly scanning for new for vulnerabilities and exploiting those vulnerabilities, etc. um, but when we look at the advertisements, when we look at the Telegram channels and the Tox channels where where the initial access brokers sell that access, we consistently see construction company, manufacturing company, etc., show up. We don't know the names of those, otherwise we'd warn them. But sort of listed in there, and so that's why we can see that there's so much there, and it's just that the vulnerabilities are out there, and they're able to take advantage of them.
Gotcha. We've got another audience question here. They're wondering if it's true that there's more state-sponsored ransomware out there now. You talked a little bit about this early, but there's sort of that mix between, what's going on state-sponsored side versus people moonlighting. What are you seeing in terms of overall state-sponsored
Yeah.
attacks?
So while state-sponsored ransomware is growing, it still accounts for less than 10% of overall ransomware attacks, at least
Wow.
by the best of our numbers. So it's a concern because you have state actors carrying out ransomware attacks, obviously, big problem, but it's still a small portion compared to all the cyber criminal activity that's out there. So I like to talk about it because it's something that people should be aware of, especially in sensitive industries that may be targeted by state sponsored. I mean, if you're in anything that has intellectual property, you may be targeted by Chinese ransomware actors because that's what China is after, or Chinese state-sponsored ransomware actors because that's what they're after. But like if you're like Iran tends to target specifically the energy industry and targets in Israel. They're not much outside of that.
Okay.
Occasionally Germany, but North Korea on the other hand is everywhere. It still doesn't account for the for much compared to the total number of attacks.
Gotcha. Here's another question. What are some of the most common methods that ransomware criminals are using to get inside a network? Is social engineering still the top vector?
Yeah. So social engineering we tend to see with the extortion only groups.
Yeah.
We don't see that as much with the encrypt and extort. So that's where the BNLAN and the Court they tend to rely a lot on social engineering. The most common tactics that we see haven't changed much. So it is phishing, Credential stuffing or credential reuse, there are literally billions of credentials out there on the underground forum. And again, you have all these initial access brokers that are constantly trying those credentials to see if they can find a weakness in the network and then turn around and sell it. Um, we do see vulnerability exploitation. Third party is another one that's growing bigger. So ransomware actors have sort of taken a page out of the nation state threat actors book, and what they'll do is they will what they'll do is they will land in a target, realize that the target has access to a bunch of other networks. So rather than deploy the ransomware there, they'll jump into these other networks and deploy. So you do have to worry about what's happening with your vendors and what your vendor security level is. And then an interesting one is the insider threat. Um, we have seen in the last 8 months or so, we've seen two cases where the ransomware actors were able to pay somebody in an overseas outsourced help desk for initial access. And I want to be very clear, they're not reaching out to direct employees who are overseas of companies. These are um, help desk employees that are working for outsourced companies. So they do help desk for a whole lot of different companies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and one of them in particular, Microsoft was able to track down. I don't think they've posted this publicly yet, so we'll keep it just between us. Um, but they were able to track down, and it was only $5,000. It cost them $5,000, which is essentially what initial access cost them into another network. And for that $5,000, that help desk person was able to get them that initial access.
Jeez.
So, I mean, of all the attacks, it's only two, but the fact that it's been successful means it's probably going to be repeated, by other ransomware actors. So, just something to keep in mind.
Gotcha. Yeah, and before I get back to some of the audience questions, one of the things that I was wondering, you talked repeatedly about drone strikes, but I'm wondering, like how many people have been arrested, um, for prosecution in U.S. courts, but they're arrested sort of outside of the U.S. And are there any like I don't know extraordinary rendition kind of things going on in countries that obviously you can't do that in Russia or it's an active war, but in sort of other places that are less cooperative with Western authorities, but those kind of actions are sort of possible.
Yeah. So the nice thing is, and this was a great example. We saw this with Hive. There were 25 countries involved in the takedown of Hive. These are countries that most of the time don't get along with each other, don't like each other, can't agree on anything, but they all hate ransomware. So
Yeah.
there hasn't actually been a problem with once somebody's arrested, getting them extradited to some place where they can stand trial,
Yeah.
or getting trial. We've pulled people from Venezuela, we've pulled people from Romania, and bought them in for trial in the U.S.
Yeah.
So I know there are at least 5 trials right now going on in the U.S. for ransomware actors that have been extradited from other countries.
Wow.
So there is a lot of cooperation right now, even from countries that don't normally get along, because every country except for Russia is really and maybe China, is really feeling the pain of ransomware right now. So all of these countries that can't get along on anything else will absolutely support each other for that, which is great. And it's great that we're getting these trials. It's great that we're getting these people arrested, but we're still always making new ransomware people while that's going on, unfortunately.
Gotcha. We've got an audience question here. It's sort of definitional. What are double and triple extortion in ransomware?
Yeah. So the idea is, um, the extortion itself is your files are encrypted, pay us to have them unencrypted. And then double extortion is we're going to leak the files if you don't do that. Like we've encrypted your files, you're not going to pay us. We stole some files, we're going to leak them if you don't pay us. And then we've seen them move to things like, we're going to launch DDoS attacks against you if you don't pay us. We're going to report you to whatever governing body you have for violations, so you'll get fined if you don't pay us, and so on. So there's all these multiple levels of extortion that the sort of the ransomware actors have developed to keep putting pressure on victims to get them to pay. It may be things like, hey, if you're not going to pay us, we're going to email all of your customers to let you know that you were hit by ransom. Or hit by a ransomware. So then you'll have a class action lawsuit, which, I mean, at least in this country, you don't need the ransomware actors to prompt you for a class action lawsuit. They'll do that on their own. So there are, there are these increasing levels of threat, if for victims who don't pay, and that's kind of what we mean by double, triple, quadruple extortion, etc.
Okay. This next one is just about, is Bitcoin still the preferred method of payment? When it comes to ransomware payments and demands.
Yeah, mostly. A lot of the ransomware actors tried to move to Monero because Monero is less traceable, but it's really hard to source Monero. So they just couldn't get paid. If they could take less money and get Monero, but they want to maximize the amount of ransom they get, and the only way to do that is with Bitcoin.
Okay. Hey, another question, sort of about the risk reward. You mentioned how cyber insurance is increasing in cost and more difficult to get. What is sort of the risk reward there? Is it still worth it to get, or or is it sort of becoming cost prohibitive?
So it depends on what you get out of it. So a lot of cyber insurance companies, if you do get hit, will provide you with incident response, third-party incident response. They will provide you with a ransomware negotiator. Even if you're not going to pay the ransom, I still highly recommend bringing in a ransomware negotiator. If nothing else, they can stall and keep them going. So there are actually a lot of benefits that you can get if you are hit. Whether or not it's worth it, that's an individual company decision, especially, as we kind of continue into a possibly worldwide recession, and it can be prohibitively expensive. But it's really, really important for you to fully understand the terms of your cyber insurance policy. What are the benefits if you get hit? What will they do for you, etc. And I mean, just sit down, especially as renewal comes up. Sit down with your insurance agent and kind of have everything clearly spelled out for you, so you understand. I think the cyber insurance industry right now is doing a lot of good things, certainly at a higher cost, but you want to make sure you'll be able to take advantage of all those benefits.
Okay. Just a couple questions left from the audience here. One, they're asking what makes a good ransomware tabletop exercise. Any best practices that you can recommend to get the most out of that effort?
Yeah. So the big thing for me is always basing it on real incidents. So that you're not just kind of making things up. Like, I love the DFIR report, because they will line out exactly how the ransomware actor got into the network, moved around their honeypot, and what tools they used, and so on. So that way you can use that to map out a tabletop exercise. But the other big thing is leadership. You have to have leadership involved in, because you don't ever want to make anyone look bad during a ransomware exercise. But if there are holes in your security, and there likely are, because we all have holes in our security, if there are holes in your security, you want leadership to be aware of it, because they're the ones who ultimately have to allocate the funds.
Right.
I mean, if y'all are sitting amongst yourself saying, man, it would be great if we had this, but there's nobody there that can actually make that decision, then it's not going to change. So having leadership involved and basing it on real world exercises, and allowing people to fully understand the impact of what a ransomware attack would have to your organization is big. You and I, and probably the people watching today, live this stuff, right? We're immersed in it every day, whether we want to be or not. Um, but the other people in our organization, may have in your organization may have really outdated ideas of what ransomware is and how bad an attack can be, and so on. And so, so giving you the chance again with leadership there to really share what the devastation could be for your organization has a real world impact, I think.
Okay. All right. And this next one comes up every time, but I know the answer to it evolves. So I'm interested in your take on what's sort of the state of the debate. But what's the general advice on making the payment versus refusing to pay?
Um, my stance has always been it's got to be a business decision
Yeah.
that, while the security person may will tell you never, ever, ever pay a ransom, um, sometimes you don't have any choice. But I'm starting to change a little bit on that to lean more towards just don't pay the ransom, because the ransomware actors are increasingly, there used to be this kind of, I don't know if it was ever true, but this feeling of honor among thieves. We'll absolutely delete your data. We'll absolutely do this. But what we're seeing more times where the ransomware actor, hey, we'll never delete your data. We know that as a fact now. But then also, um, they keep coming back for more. That's we used to see this in the 70s with kidnappings in Italy, right?
Hmm.
So Italy in early 1981 outlawed paying ransom, right? No ransom being paid if somebody kidnapped you, and that sucked for families, right? But the rich families, that was okay because they could, they had assets overseas and they could use those overseas assets to pay the ransom demand. And then what the kidnapper would do is come back to them and say, "Oh, we're going to tell the Italian government you paid us the ransom, and then you're going to go to jail for that, and so you'd have to pay a second ransom." And so we're seeing more and more of this where the ransomware actors will double dip and try and come back for more. If at all possible, you really, really shouldn't pay the ransom. I mean, if your business is going to go under, obviously you don't have any choice. Continue to do so.
Yeah.
But again, with these increasingly ruthless tactics that we see from the ransomware actors, if you pay them once, you're going to wind up paying again for something.
That's a really interesting historical example. And I don't know if you know, but like, did Italy ever sort of ultimately solve that problem in a way that might be informative for the ransomware problem?
So actually, I'm writing a research paper on that, and I don't know the answer to that yet. But maybe we can talk about that later. But
All right.
we're actually doing a historical analysis of ransomware or ransom kidnappings and ransom in Italy and in Colombia, um, to see what kind of lessons learned. Things like there's kidnapping insurance that you had in those countries. There's and what impact that had on the industry,
Yeah.
and what impact the laws had on the industry, and so on. So we're in the process of working through that. It's probably something we'll have out in May or June. But yeah, I will let you know. But yeah, we're absolutely looking at the sort of the historical analogies.
We'd love to have you back on to talk about that when you're ready to. I guess the last question, a good one here from the audience to close on is, do you think overall the ransomware threat is growing or receding?
I think there are fewer ransom attacks, but I think the ones that we're seeing are worse.
Okay. Well, Alan, it's always great to have you on. Really appreciate all your insights here today, and your up to the moment knowledge of what's going on in the ransomware world is invaluable. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you all for attending today. Always appreciate the great questions and the great audience here from these events.
All right. And before we wrap up, we have one more piece of business. It's the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $250 Amazon gift card today is Gerald Stubblefield from California. So congratulations to Gerald. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Nasuni and Palo Alto for making this event possible through their sponsorships. And thanks as always for attending. And as Alan said, thanks for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.